Alright, let's talk about one of the most dangerous and nearly catastrophic events in the history of the Imperium, the Novaterra Interregnum. This wasn't just some minor political squabble or a rebellion on the fringes of the galaxy. This was a full-scale fracture of the Imperium itself, a moment when mankind's greatest empire teetered on the edge of total collapse. For nearly 1,000 years, the Imperium was divided in a way that hadn't been seen since the Horus Heresy, and some even argue that this period came dangerously close to finishing what Horus started. Imagine it, half the Imperium refusing to recognize Terra's authority, powerful warlords carving out their own dominions, Chaos and Xenos predators circling like vultures, ready to strike. Trade routes were severed, communication networks failed, and war became an everyday reality. For a moment, it seemed like mankind's great empire, forged through blood and fire, might finally splinter into warring factions, never to recover. But why did this happen? How did the Imperium allow itself to be so divided? What were the true stakes of this interregnum? To understand that, we need to go back to the years before the crisis, when the seeds of this disaster were first sown. The Novaterra Interregnum didn't just appear out of nowhere. Like all great disasters, it was the result of years, centuries even, of slow-building tension, ignored problems, and growing divisions within the Imperium. To some, it was inevitable. To others, it was a catastrophe that could have been avoided if only the High Lords of Terra had acted sooner. But what exactly led to this moment? What factors pushed the Imperium to the brink of civil war? At its core, the Interregnum was a crisis of power. By this time in Imperial history, the Adeptus Terra had become an unwieldy, bureaucratic nightmare, bloated with officials who cared more about their own influence than the survival of mankind. The Imperium had grown vast, too vast for Terra, to effectively govern. The Segmentum Administratum, the military, even the ecclesiarchy, all of them were growing increasingly independent, stretching the definition of what imperial unity really meant. And the further you got from Holy Terra, the more you saw it. The Segmentum Pacificus and the Segmentum Ultima had, for all intents and purposes, begun operating as semi-autonomous regions. But it wasn't just bureaucracy. The Imperium's military structure was beginning to show cracks too. The sheer number of war fronts had left the Astra Militarum overstretched, and the Adeptus Astartes were never numerous enough to hold entire war zones by themselves. Rogue traders, once the daring explorers of mankind, were becoming outright warlords in their own right, amassing personal fleets that rivaled Imperial Navy battle groups. And when you add in the fact that entire sectors were being forced to defend themselves with little to no aid from Terra, the question began to arise. Why should they remain loyal to a distant, seemingly indifferent throne world? Of course, the ecclesiarchy played its part in all of this as well. This was an age when the influence of the ecclesiarchy was at its peak, and religious dogma was being forced upon worlds in ways that some planetary rulers found intolerable. The cult imperialis was no longer just a unifying faith. It was a weapon wielded by those who sought power. Wars of faith erupted, and with them, the seeds of division were sown even deeper. Some sectors began to push back against Terra's growing religious authoritarianism, refusing to bend to the will of the ecclesiarchy. And then there was Novaterra itself. This wasn't just a random splinter group. It was a political movement that had been growing for centuries. Located in the distant Segmentum Pacificus, Novaterra became the heart of a new ideological divide, one that questioned whether Terra even had the right to rule the entire galaxy. To them, the Imperium had become stagnant, or corrupt, weighed down by an elite class that cared more for their own power than for humanity's survival. So why not break away? Why not form a new government, one free of Terra's suffocating grip? There's an ongoing debate among fans about whether Novaterra had a legitimate point. Some argue that they were nothing more than ambitious warlords, using idealism as an excuse to seize power. Others see them as the first real attempt to fix an imperium that had become too vast and too centralized to function properly. The truth is likely somewhere in between. But what's undeniable is that their rise to power was a direct result of the Imperium's own failings. By the time the crisis truly erupted, the Imperium was already in a precarious state. The Legiones Astartes were fractured, with some chapters showing open discontent toward Terra's rule. The Astra Militarum was divided, some generals seeing Novaterra as a viable alternative to the status quo. The ecclesiarchy was fanning the flames, declaring entire sectors as heretical for questioning the God Emperor's divine authority. And chaos? The ruinous powers were watching, waiting, laughing as the Imperium turned on itself once more. This was the powder keg. All it needed was a single spark. And when Novaterra finally declared itself an independent entity, refusing to recognize the rule of the High Lords of Terra, the Imperium's worst nightmare became a reality. Novaterra didn't rise overnight. It wasn't some sudden rebellion led by a rogue warlord or a heretical cult trying to break free from imperial rule. No, this was something far more dangerous. A slow, calculated shift in power that had been brewing for centuries, fed by dissatisfaction, ambition, and the sheer undeniable reality that the Imperium was simply too vast to be governed effectively from a single world. At the heart of it all was the Segmentum Pacificus. This was one of the wealthiest and most powerful regions of the Imperium, filled with forge worlds, hive cities, and strategic trade hubs that kept the great imperial machine running. But it was also one of the most independent. With Terra's bureaucracy choking under its own inefficiency, local governors, admirals, and military commanders had started taking matters into their own hands. The High Lords of Terra might have still claimed absolute authority, but in reality, their reach was slipping. Then came Novaterra, the new power center that would openly challenge Terra's dominance. The rulers of this faction weren't just some upstart separatists. They were imperial officials, planetary governors, and noble houses who had grown tired of watching Terra drown in its own excesses. And the moment they saw an opportunity to seize real power, they took it. This is where things get interesting. Unlike past uprisings, Novaterra wasn't built on open rebellion. It didn't start with war. It started with politics. The leaders of the Novaterra faction didn't declare war against Terra. Immediately, they simply stopped recognizing its authority. No great battle, no sudden coup, just a quiet but undeniable shift. They set up their own bureaucratic network, their own trade agreements, and their own chain of command, all while claiming to still be part of the Imperium. In their eyes, they weren't traitors. They were the true Imperium, the ones who actually understood how to govern in an age where Terra had become little more than a relic of a forgotten past. And they weren't alone. Support for Novaterra spread like wildfire, especially among the noble houses and ruling elite of the Segmentum Pacificus. Many of these dynasties had ruled their worlds for generations, answering only to Terra out of tradition rather than necessity. The promise of greater autonomy, unrestricted trade, and a chance to reshape the Imperium in their own image was too tempting to resist. Entire sectors threw their allegiance behind Novaterra, cutting off tithes to the Adeptus Administratum and forming their own power blocks. The Astra Militarum was another major factor. By this point in history, the Imperial Guard was not some unified force. It was a collection of countless regiments, each loyal first and foremost to their own commanders and homeworlds. When Novaterra began to rise, many generals and warlords saw which way the wind was blowing. Some sided with Terra, unwilling to abandon the throne world, but others saw the potential in a new order, free from the stagnation that had defined the Imperium for millennia. This led to brutal power struggles within the Guard, with entire regiments splitting in loyalty, brothers in arms turning against one another in a war that had yet to be declared. And then there was the ecclesiarchy. If there's one thing the Imperial Church has never tolerated, it's competition. The rise of Novaterra wasn't just a political problem, it was a religious crisis. The Adeptus Ministorum had spent centuries solidifying its control over the faith of the Imperium, ensuring that worship of the Emperor remained centralized and unchallenged. But the rulers of Novaterra had different ideas. Many of them wanted a more secular Imperium, free from the increasingly oppressive rule of the ecclesiarchy. Others supported alternative interpretations of the Imperial Creed, ones that didn't align with the strict doctrine enforced by Terra. This created a rift that would only deepen as the conflict escalated, with fanatical priests and warrior clerics launching brutal purges against those who dared question their authority. There's an ongoing debate among fans about just how strong Novaterra really was at its peak. Some argue that it was never a true rival to Terra, that it was doomed from the start because it lacked the military might to challenge the full force of the Imperium. Others believe that if things had played out just a little differently, Novaterra could have become a permanent power, splitting the Imperium into two rival factions that might have evolved into something resembling the pre-heresy era of the Great Crusade. What's undeniable, though, is that Novaterra had something the Imperium rarely saw: momentum. It wasn't just a rebellion, it was an idea, a belief that the Imperium as it stood was broken and that it was time for something new. And for a time, it looked like that idea might actually succeed. But as history has shown, the Imperium does not tolerate division, and sooner or later, war was inevitable. For most of the Imperium, war is a distant thing. A battle fought on some forgotten world, a crusade waged in the name of the Emperor, an enemy crushed in the void between the stars. Things that happen somewhere else, far from the daily struggles of ordinary citizens just trying to survive. But when the Novaterra Interregnum began, that illusion shattered. War wasn't at the edges of the galaxy anymore. It was everywhere. This wasn't just a conflict between two factions fighting for power. It was a schism. One that split the Imperium at every level. Entire systems were caught in the crossfire, governors were forced to pick sides, and trade routes that had existed for thousands of years were suddenly severed overnight. If you were a planetary ruler, you had one impossible choice to make: remain loyal to Terra and risk being cut off from supplies, or swear allegiance to Novaterra and gamble on the possibility that this rebellion wouldn't collapse within a few centuries. And if you were just an ordinary citizen, you had no choice at all. You either adapted or you died. Trade was the first to suffer. The Imperium relies on a delicate balance of logistics. Agri worlds feed Forge worlds supply Hive worlds, and Hive worlds churn out soldiers and manpower for the endless wars across the galaxy. But when the Novaterra Interregnum broke that system apart, it sent shockwaves through the entire economy of mankind. A Forge world that once received monthly shipments of food now faced starvation. A Hive world that once provided millions of recruits to the Imperial Guard suddenly found itself abandoned, left to fend off growing insurrections and riots. The once reliable trade convoys of the Munitorum, escorted by the mighty warships of the Imperial Navy, now found themselves navigating a galaxy where everyone was a potential enemy. And it wasn't just Imperial forces they had to worry about. With the Imperium locked in civil strife, countless predatory forces took the opportunity to strike. Chaos warbands, long held at bay by the unity of the Imperium, found new opportunities to raid vulnerable systems. Orc warlords saw the perfect moment to launch their invasions, knowing that the Imperium's response would be sluggish at best. Eldar corsairs, sensing a chance to manipulate the conflict for their own ends, began striking at key targets, sowing discord while staying just out of reach of the larger fleets. There's even speculation among some fans that the Tyranids, still largely unknown at the time, might have begun their first small incursions into the galaxy, testing the Imperium's defenses while it was too distracted to notice. The situation was even worse in the Void. The Imperial Navy, once the great shield of mankind, found itself completely fractured. Some admirals remained loyal to Terra, refusing to acknowledge Novaterra's authority, while others saw the writing on the wall and switched sides. This led to brutal fleet engagements, battles that weren't fought against Xenos or heretics, but between fellow Imperials. Even more devastating were the rogue commanders who saw the chaos as an opportunity to carve out their own petty empires, turning their fleets into mercenary forces that sold their allegiance to the highest bidder. One of the most tragic aspects of the Interregnum was what happened to those caught in the middle. There were entire worlds that wanted nothing to do with this war, planets that simply wished to continue their lives without choosing a side. But neutrality was not an option. A world that refused to pick a side would be seen as a threat by both factions. Imperial forces, driven by paranoia and a fear of losing even more ground, would declare them traitors for failing to declare loyalty to Terra. Novaterra's supporters, desperate for resources, would see them as potential assets to be absorbed by force. These worlds became battlefields, whether they wanted to or not. There are countless horror stories from this period. Planets left to starve when their supply lines were cut, merchant fleets destroyed simply for trying to continue trade between both factions, civilians massacred for suspected disloyalty. Some even say that the Inquisition, fearing that the instability of the war could lead to widespread chaos corruption, began preemptively purging entire sectors, wiping out populations before they could even have the chance to fall to the ruinous powers. Whether or not that's true is up for debate, but one thing is certain. This was a dark time for the Imperium, one where survival depended not on faith, but on sheer luck. Fans still argue about whether this period could have been handled differently. Some believe that if Terra had acted more decisively, it could have prevented the worst of the crisis, stabilizing the Imperium before things got out of control. Others argue that Novaterra represented a necessary evolution, a sign that the Imperium needed to change in order to survive. But one thing everyone agrees on is that the cost of this war was staggering. Millions of worlds, billions of lives, and an entire era of history lost in the flames of a war that could have torn humanity apart for good. And yet, through all the chaos, through all the destruction, the war had yet to reach its true breaking point. Because as bad as things were, the real fighting was only just beginning. The Novaterra Interregnum wasn't just a political crisis. It wasn't just a breakdown of trade, governance, and authority. It was war, one that spread across the Imperium like a wildfire, consuming entire sectors in bloodshed and devastation. And the worst part? This war wasn't fought against Xenos or Chaos, but between mankind itself. Brother against brother, fleet against fleet. A nightmare scenario the Imperium had barely survived once before, during the Horus Heresy. The moment open war began, it became clear just how fragile the Imperium truly was. The sheer scale of the conflict was staggering. Hundreds of systems, entire subsectors, each one forced to declare loyalty to either Novaterra or Terra itself. Some planets saw their ruling classes divided, with one half siding with the Imperium and the other pledging allegiance to the breakaway faction. Others were simply conquered by force, their populations caught in a brutal power struggle where neither side was willing to back down. One of the deadliest theaters of war was the Segmentum Pacificus, the very heart of Novaterra's. The power. This was where the breakaway faction was strongest, where their fleets and armies had been allowed to grow unchecked for centuries. When Terra finally launched its full-scale counteroffensive, it wasn't a swift, decisive strike. It was a grind, a slow and agonizing war of attrition where neither side could gain the upper hand. The Imperial Navy, once thought to be invincible, found itself evenly matched by Novaterra's fleets, which had spent decades fortifying key systems and constructing warships outside of Terra's control. Some battles dragged on for decades, entire generations of soldiers living and dying in wars that had no end in sight. The fighting on the ground was just as horrific. Some of the bloodiest campaigns took place on the fortress worlds along the border between Novaterra and Loyalist space. These planets had been fortified to withstand Xenos invasions, but now they were turned into graveyards, with trench warfare, orbital bombardments, and brutal urban combat, becoming the norm. Millions died in planetary sieges that lasted for centuries. Entire hive cities turned into nothing more than mountains of rubble. One of the most infamous battles was the siege of Bellis Prime, a former trading hub that had become a critical supply point for Novaterra. The Imperium knew they had to take it back, and so they threw everything they had at it, entire regiments of the Astra Militarum, legions of Skitari, and even Titan legions. But Novaterra wasn't about to give it up without a fight. The defenders had dug in deep, turning the planet into a fortress unlike anything the Imperium had faced before. The battle lasted over 200 years, with wave after wave of Imperial forces crashing against an unbreakable defense. Some say Bellis Prime fell only because the defenders simply ran out of people to hold the line, their final warriors choosing to die in the ruins rather than surrender to Terra's forces. The Battle of Helican Rift was another turning point. This was a naval engagement on a scale that rivaled the greatest battles of the Horus Heresy. It was here that the Imperial Navy and the fleets of Novaterra finally clashed in open space, with thousands of warships locked in brutal combat. Entire battle groups were wiped out in a single engagement, massive battleships torn apart by relentless broadsides and lance fire. Some legends say the debris from this battle still drifts through the system, a silent graveyard of ships that once carried millions of soldiers to their deaths. And then there were the hidden wars, the shadow conflicts fought in the dark, far from the battlefields of the known galaxy. The Officio Assassinorum was let loose upon the leaders of Novaterra, sending their deadliest agents to eliminate key figures in the rebellion. But Novaterra had its own network of spies and saboteurs, infiltrating Terra's Loyalist forces and spreading discontent wherever they could. There are stories of entire planets falling. Without a single battle, their rulers assassinated in the dead of night, their military forces turning on each other in the chaos that followed. What made this war so dangerous was that it had no clear front lines. This wasn't a war where one side simply pushed forward, taking system after system until victory was assured. It was fractured, a war fought in 1,000 different places at once, with no real way to tell who was winning or losing. Some planets changed hands multiple times, their populations caught in an endless cycle of conquest and reconquest. Others simply vanished, their fates unknown, either destroyed by orbital bombardments or claimed by forces even more sinister than the two warring factions. And the worst part? The Imperium was losing. Not in the sense that Terra was about to fall, but in the sense that every year, every battle, every world lost to the chaos of war weakened humanity as a whole. The Imperium had barely survived the Horus Heresy. It had barely survived the Age of Apostasy. And now, once again, it was on the brink of annihilation, not because of some external enemy, but because of its own inability to maintain unity. Some fans speculate that if Novaterra had pushed just a little harder, if a few key battles had gone differently, the Imperium might have actually shattered. That instead of a victorious reunification, we could be living in a timeline where humanity is permanently split between multiple warring factions, each claiming to be the true inheritors of the Emperor's will. Others argue that Novaterra was doomed from the start, that their power was always temporary, that Terra's sheer weight, its bureaucracy, its faith, its control over the Astronomicon was simply too much for any rebellion to overcome. But at the time, none of that mattered. All that mattered was survival, and for a moment, a long, bloody, horrifying moment, it really seemed like the Imperium might not make it out of this war alive. The Novaterra Interregnum wasn't just a political crisis. It wasn't just a breakdown of trade, governance, and authority. It was war, one that spread across the Imperium like a wildfire, consuming entire sectors in bloodshed and devastation. And the worst part? This war wasn't fought against Xenos or Chaos, but between mankind itself, brother against brother, fleet against fleet. A nightmare scenario the Imperium had barely survived once before during the Horus Heresy. The moment open war began, it became clear just how fragile the Imperium truly was. The sheer scale of the conflict was staggering. Hundreds of systems, entire subsectors, each one forced to declare loyalty to either Novaterra or Terra itself. Some planets saw their ruling classes divided, with one half siding with the Imperium and the other pledging allegiance to the breakaway faction. Others were simply conquered by force, their populations caught in a brutal power struggle where neither side was willing to back down. One of the deadliest theaters of war was the Segmentum Pacificus, the very heart of Novaterra's power. This was where the breakaway faction was strongest, where their fleets and armies had been allowed to grow unchecked for centuries. When Terra finally launched its full-scale counteroffensive, it wasn't a swift, decisive strike. It was a grind, a slow and agonizing war of attrition where neither side could gain the upper hand. The Imperial Navy, once thought to be invincible, found itself evenly matched by Novaterra's fleets, which had spent decades fortifying key systems and constructing warships outside of Terra's control. Some battles dragged on for decades, entire generations of soldiers living and dying in wars that had no end in sight. The fighting on the ground was just as horrific. Some of the bloodiest campaigns took place on the fortress worlds along the border between Novaterra and Loyalist space. These planets had been fortified to withstand Xenos invasions, but now they were turned into graveyards with trench warfare, orbital bombardments, and brutal urban combat becoming the norm. Millions died in planetary sieges that lasted for centuries. Entire hive cities turned into nothing more than mountains of rubble. One of the most infamous battles was the siege of Bellis Prime, a former trading hub that had become a critical supply point for Novaterra. The Imperium knew they had to take it back, and so they threw everything they had at it. Entire regiments of the Astra Militarum, legions of Skitari, and even Titan legions. But Novaterra wasn't about to give it up without a fight. The defenders had dug in deep, turning the planet into a fortress unlike anything the Imperium had faced before. The battle lasted over 200 years, with wave after wave of Imperial forces crashing against an unbreakable defense. Some say Bellis Prime fell only because the defenders simply ran out of people to hold the line, their final warriors choosing to die in the ruins rather than surrender to Terra's forces. The Battle of Helican Rift was another turning point. This was a naval engagement on a scale that rivaled the greatest battles of the Horus Heresy. It was here that the Imperial Navy and the fleets of Novaterra finally clashed in open space, with thousands of warships locked in brutal combat. Entire battle groups were wiped out in a single engagement, massive battleships torn apart by relentless broadsides and lance fire. Some legends say the debris from this battle still drifts through the system, a silent graveyard of ships that once carried millions of soldiers to their deaths. And then there were the hidden wars, the shadow conflicts fought in the dark, far from the battlefields of the known galaxy. The Officio Assassinorum was let loose upon the leaders of Novaterra, sending their deadliest agents to eliminate key figures in the rebellion. But Novaterra had its own network of spies and saboteurs infiltrating Terra's loyalist forces and spreading discontent wherever they could. There are stories of entire planets falling without a single battle, their rulers assassinated in the dead of night, their military forces turning on each other in the chaos that followed. What made this war so dangerous was that it had no clear front lines. This wasn't a war where one side simply pushed forward, taking system after system until victory was assured. It was fractured, a war fought in 1,000 different places at once, with no real way to tell who was winning or losing. Some planets changed hands multiple times, their populations caught in an endless cycle of conquest and reconquest. Others simply vanished, their fates unknown, either destroyed by orbital bombardments or claimed by forces even more sinister than the two warring factions. And the worst part? The Imperium was losing. Not in the sense that Terra was about to fall, but in the sense that every year, every battle, every world lost to the chaos of war weakened humanity as a whole. The Imperium had barely survived the Horus Heresy. It had barely survived the Age of Apostasy. And now, once again, it was on the brink of annihilation, not because of some external enemy, but because of its own inability to maintain unity. Some fans speculate that if Novaterra had pushed just a little harder, if a few key battles had gone differently, the Imperium might have actually shattered. That instead of a victorious reunification, we could be living in a timeline where humanity is permanently split between multiple warring factions, each claiming to be the true inheritors of the Emperor's will. Others argue that Novaterra was doomed from the start, that their power was always temporary, that Terra's sheer weight, its bureaucracy, its faith, its control over the Astronomicon, was simply too much for any rebellion to overcome. But at the time, none of that mattered. All that mattered was survival. And for a moment, a long, bloody, horrifying moment, it really seemed like the Imperium might not make it out of this war alive. Wars in the Imperium are never just about firepower. Sure, fleets clash, worlds burn, and trillions die, but the real battles, the ones that decide the fate of the galaxy, they happen in the shadows. In whispered conversations between High Lords, in the sanctums of the ecclesiarchy, where faith is forged into a weapon, in the endless bureaucratic labyrinths of the administratum, where a single denied supply request can doom an entire war effort. The Novaterra Interregnum was no different. It wasn't just a war of soldiers and fleets. It was a war of politics, faith, and power. And in those arenas, the Adeptus Ministorum and the Adeptus Administratum were the ones pulling the strings. Let's start with the ecclesiarchy. If there's one thing the priesthood of the Imperium cannot tolerate, it's division. The cult imperialis is the foundation of imperial society, the glue that holds the entire Imperium together. Without faith, without absolute belief in the Emperor's divine will, the Imperium crumbles. So when Novaterra declared its independence, the ecclesiarchy didn't just see it as a political rebellion. They saw it as heresy, a challenge to the spiritual unity of mankind, and they reacted with the kind of fury only religious fanatics are capable of. The moment Novaterra's leadership refused to bend the knee to Terra, the ecclesiarchy unleashed a holy war. Preachers flooded the Loyalist worlds, stirring up hatred against the separatists, declaring them not just rebels, but blasphemers who had turned away from the Emperor's light. Those who remained loyal to Terra were told they were fighting not just for the Imperium, but for the very soul of mankind. Any compromise with Novaterra was unthinkable. This wasn't just about politics anymore, this was about faith. But here's where things get complicated. Not everyone in the ecclesiarchy agreed with this approach. In some sectors, powerful cardinals and religious leaders actually sympathized with Novaterra. They saw it as an opportunity to reform the Imperium, to break free from the bloated, corrupt influence of Terra's ruling elite. Some even started preaching alternative interpretations of the Imperial Creed, ones that emphasized the Emperor as a mortal ruler rather than a god. To the more radical factions of the ecclesiarchy, this was outright heresy, and they responded in the only way they knew how, with fire. This led to what some historians call the Silent Purge, a series of brutal inquisitorial crackdowns on planets where Novaterra's religious influence had started to spread. Entire congregations were erased, their priests burned at the stake for daring to question the ecclesiarchy's absolute control. There are even rumors that some rogue branches of the Ministorum began deploying death cult assassins to eliminate rival priests before their ideas could spread too far. And then there's the Adeptus Administratum. If the ecclesiarchy ruled through faith, the Administratum ruled through control. Every tithe, every military campaign, every trade route in the Imperium runs through the endless halls of the Administratum's data vaults. And in a war like this, information was as powerful as any fleet. At first, Terra's bureaucrats tried to choke Novaterra into submission. They cut off trade, denied access to the Imperium's vast logistical network, and declared that any world supporting the Separatists would no longer receive essential supplies. But Novaterra's leadership was prepared. They had been building their own bureaucratic infrastructure for centuries, crafting an economic system that could operate independently from Terra's influence. This led to a Cold War of logistics, where the real battlefield wasn't in the stars, but in the vast networks of scribes and bureaucrats who controlled the flow of resources. Imperial Loyalists would reroute shipments, cutting off Novaterra's supply chains. Novaterra's agents would counterfeit orders, stealing supplies meant for Terra's forces. This war of ink and parchment, fought in dusty record halls and endless stacks of data scrolls, might sound dull compared to the great battles raging across the stars, but it was just as deadly. Entire campaigns were won or lost based on whether or not the right warships received fuel, whether soldiers got their rations, whether ammunition shipments reached the front lines on time. And there's another angle to this, one that no one likes to talk about. The High Lords of Terra profited from this war. War always breeds opportunity, and there were plenty of opportunists within the Administratum who saw the chaos as a chance to strengthen their own positions. Some factions within the Administratum dragged out the conflict on purpose, sabotaging peace talks, misdirecting critical reinforcements, and even leaking strategic intelligence to ensure that the war would continue. Why? Because in war, power flows toward those who control resources. The longer the conflict dragged on, the more influence the Administratum gained over the Imperium's fractured structure. Some fans argue that the Novaterra Interregnum could have ended much sooner if not for the Administratum's interference. That the bureaucrats on Terra weren't really interested in a quick resolution. They wanted absolute control, and they knew that as long as the war continued, they could justify more oversight, more centralization, more authority over the Imperium's vast infrastructure. In this way, some believe that the true victors of the Novaterra Interregnum weren't the soldiers who fought and died, but the faceless bureaucrats who ensured that, no matter the outcome, their grip on the Imperium would be stronger than ever. The worst part? This isn't even speculation. There are actual records from this period, documents that show critical supply convoys being intentionally delayed, entire battle fleets being rerouted away from key conflicts, orders that make no sense from a strategic perspective. It's almost as if some unseen hand was managing the war, making sure it didn't end too soon, making sure the Imperium bled just enough to justify an even tighter rule once the dust settled. In the end, both the Ecclesiarchy and the Administratum played critical roles in the war. The Ecclesiarchy turned it into a holy struggle, ensuring that there could be no diplomatic resolution. The Administratum turned it into a bureaucratic one, ensuring that it could never truly end until they had reshaped the Imperium to their liking. The war was raging, the Imperium was fracturing, and the question remained: how long could mankind survive fighting itself? Because as much as Novaterra and Terra were locked in their struggle for dominance, there were other forces in the galaxy watching, waiting, and preparing to strike. When war splits the Imperium, it's not the bureaucrats or priests that determine its fate. It's the warriors. And in a galaxy where a single Astartes can take on an army and a Titan can level a city with a single step, the question of who these godlike warriors fight for becomes a matter of survival. So when the Novaterra Interregnum fractured the Imperium, the Adeptus Astartes and the Titan legions found themselves in an impossible situation. Loyalty in the Imperium is absolute. At least, that's what the High Lords want everyone to believe. But the reality? It's complicated. The Adeptus Astartes, despite their unbreakable oaths, were never a monolithic force. Each chapter was its own kingdom, its own culture with its own traditions and political leanings. Some had deep ties to Terra, honoring it as the sacred heart of the Imperium. Others saw it as little more than a bureaucratic fossil, unworthy of their obedience. And then there were those who cared only for their own survival, ready to adapt to whatever power structure seemed strongest. When Novaterra rose, many chapters hesitated. The High Lords of Terra expected blind loyalty from the Space Marines, but the truth is, Terra was distant, and Novaterra was right there. Some chapters in the Segmentum Pacificus, those who had long been cut off from Terra's direct influence, saw no reason to side with a throne world that had barely acknowledged their existence for centuries. Others, bound by ancient ties of honor and debt, saw Novaterra's leaders as false Imperials, traitors who threatened the very foundation of mankind. Some of the most famous chapters to remain steadfastly loyal to Terra were those with strong connections to the Imperial Fist's lineage, the ones who had always considered themselves the true guardians of the Imperium's traditions. The Crimson Fists, for example, reportedly waged a brutal purge against Novaterra's supporters in the Pacificus war zones, launching strike raids that crippled their military command. The Black Templars, unsurprisingly, declared the Novaterrans heretics from the moment war broke out, seeing their defiance as yet another affront to the Emperor's divine rule. Their crusade fleets tore through Novaterra's forces with righteous fury, cutting a path of destruction through rebellious systems. But not all chapters sided with Terra. Some, like the Nova Hawks, pledged themselves to Novaterra, arguing that the High Lords had long since abandoned the true vision of the Imperium. The Storm Serpents, a chapter that had been stationed deep in the Pacificus for centuries, reportedly swore allegiance to Novaterra out of pure pragmatism, believing that siding with the breakaway faction was the only way to ensure their survival in the chaos. And then there were those who played both sides. The Fireclaws, later known as the Red Corsairs, were notorious for switching allegiances when it suited them. There are records of them fighting under the banner of Novaterra in some campaigns, only to later turn on their allies when it became clear that Terra was gaining the upper hand. Some say this was simple opportunism. Others argue that they were merely using the conflict to weaken both factions before pursuing their own goals. The Titan legions, however, were a different beast altogether. Unlike the Astartes, whose loyalties could shift based on their chapter's culture or politics, the Collegia Titanica was far more rigid in its allegiances. Titans are not just war machines. They are symbols of imperial power, embodiments of the machine god's wrath. Their crews are bound by unwavering loyalty to the Omnissiah, and as such, most Titan legions remained loyal to Terra. But even among the Titan legions, there were exceptions. Some Forge worlds aligned themselves with Novaterra, seeing the breakaway faction as a chance to free themselves from the iron grip of Mars. The most infamous case was the Legio Suturvora, also known as the Godstalkers. This Titan legion turned against Terra, believing that Novaterra's vision of the Imperium was more sustainable than the decaying rule of the High Lords. Their war engines became some of the most devastating tools in Novaterra's military campaigns, leveling entire hive cities that resisted the breakaway faction. The Loyalist Titan legions, however, were relentless. The Legio Ignatum, one of the most storied and battle-hardened Titan forces in history, spearheaded countless assaults against Novaterra strongholds, their war horns blaring as they marched across the battlefield. The Legio Griffonicus, the War Griffins, played a key role in the reconquest of rebellious Forge worlds, shattering enemy Titans in duels that echoed the battles of the Horus Heresy. There are some who believe that if the Titan legions had been more divided, the war might have gone differently. The Titans, after all, are the ultimate weapons of destruction in the Imperium's arsenal, machines capable of turning entire wars with their sheer presence. If more Legios had sided with Novaterra, if they had pushed further into Loyalist space, perhaps the Imperium would have fractured permanently. But as history shows, the Titan legions, for all their power, are still bound by their machine cult's rigid structure. And in the end, that structure favored Terra. Some fans argue that the true reason Novaterra lost wasn't just because of politics or faith or even military might. It was because they lacked enough Astartes and Titan support to challenge Terra in the long run. The Astra Militarum is vast, but it is not invincible. Without the strategic brilliance and overwhelming force of the Astartes, without the sheer destructive power of the Titans, Novaterra could never truly match the Imperium's war machine. But even though the majority of the Space Marines and Titan legions sided with Terra, the fact that there was any division at all is terrifying to think about. The Imperium isn't supposed to break like this. The Astartes are supposed to be unshakable. The Titans are supposed to be unstoppable. And yet, here they were, fighting each other, taking opposite sides in a war that never should have happened. And the scariest part, this wasn't even the worst of it. Because while the Imperium was tearing itself apart, there were others in the galaxy watching, waiting, ready to strike when the moment was right. The true consequences of the Novaterra Interregnum weren't just about which side won or lost. It was about what this war left behind, a wounded Imperium, bleeding, vulnerable, and ripe for the horrors that would follow. If there's one universal truth about the Warhammer 40K universe, it's that the enemies of mankind are always watching. The moment the Imperium shows weakness, they strike. It doesn't matter if it's Xenos, heretics, or the horrors of the warp. When humanity turns on itself, the vultures start circling. And during the Novaterra Interregnum, the Imperium wasn't just vulnerable, it was bleeding out. The question isn't if the enemies of mankind took advantage of the situation. It's how much damage they managed to do before Terra and Novaterra even noticed what was happening. Let's start with chaos, because if there's any force in the galaxy that thrives on division and civil war, it's the ruinous powers. For the Dark Gods, the Novaterra Interregnum was a gift. A broken Imperium fighting itself, distracted and desperate? That's prime hunting ground for the servants of the warp. Chaos thrives on conflict, and the war between Terra and Novaterra flooded the warp with suffering. Entire planets were consumed by war, millions of souls perishing in battles that had no end in sight. That kind of raw psychic energy is like ringing a dinner bell in the warp. The barriers between reality and madness grew thinner, demonic incursions becoming more frequent as the conflict dragged on. Some systems, already isolated from Terra's influence, fell completely, not to Novaterra, not to the Imperium, but to the madness of chaos. Then there were the Chaos Space Marines, the traitor legions, and their warbands had been waiting for a moment like this for millennia. Many of them still carried the wounds of the Horus heresy, still burned with hatred for the Imperium that had barely survived their first great betrayal. This was their chance to strike, not as a united force, but as a swarm of predators, each seeking to carve out their own empire in the ruins of a divided Imperium. Some warbands infiltrated the conflict directly, pretending to support one side or the other, only to turn on their so-called allies when the time was right. The word-bearers in particular are believed to have manipulated certain Imperial commanders, convincing them that Novaterra was the true vision of the Emperor's dream, all while planting the seeds of corruption within their ranks. Other warbands, like the Black Legion, simply waited, letting both factions exhaust themselves before launching raids deep into Imperial space. But the most terrifying theory, some believe that Novaterra itself was being influenced by chaos from the very beginning. That somewhere, hidden among their ranks, were individuals who knew exactly what they were doing, who saw the war not as a means of liberation, but as the first step in shattering the Imperium beyond repair. Was this deliberate manipulation by a chaos cult? A sleeper cell hidden within the rebellion's leadership? Maybe. Maybe not. But the fact that the war led to so many worlds being lost to the warp makes you wonder. And chaos wasn't the only threat. The Xenos empires of the galaxy had their own agendas, and none of them were going to sit idly by while the Imperium self-destructed. The Eldar, as always, knew what was coming before anyone else. Their Farseers had no doubt foreseen the consequences of the Interregnum, and they played their usual game: manipulation, sabotage, and precise calculated strikes that ensured the war played out in a way that suited them. Some craft worlds were believed to have aided specific Imperial factions, guiding them to victory in certain battles, not because they cared about the Imperium, but because they feared what would happen if Novaterra collapsed completely. A fully broken Imperium? That meant more chaos, more destruction, more ripples in the fabric of fate that could bring doom to their dying race. But not all Eldar agreed on what should be done. The Dark Eldar, for example, saw the Interregnum as nothing more than a hunting season. With Imperial defenses weakened, they launched some of their boldest raids in centuries, targeting isolated war zones where both sides were too distracted to stop them. Entire worlds disappeared overnight, their populations dragged screaming into the dark abyss of Kamara. And then there were the orcs. If there's one thing that gets an orc excited, it's a good fight. And the Novaterra Interregnum? That was the biggest, loudest fight in the galaxy. The war created power vacuums, entire systems left unguarded as both sides pulled their forces into the main conflict. For the orcs, this was the perfect excuse to start some of the biggest wah the Segmentum Pacificus had seen in centuries. Some of these orc hordes became so massive that neither Terra nor Novaterra could handle them alone. There are records of temporary truces being declared between Loyalist and Separatist forces, not because they wanted peace, but because an even bigger threat was coming straight for them. These battles were desperate, brutal, and often ended with both Imperial factions barely surviving, only for them to turn on each other again as soon as the orcs were dealt with. And then there were the silent threats, the ones that didn't make grand, obvious moves, but were definitely watching. The Necrons were still awakening across the galaxy, their tomb world stirring beneath the surface of seemingly unremarkable planets. Did they intervene directly in the war? Probably not. But some believe that certain strategic planets that were completely erased from Imperial records during this time weren't destroyed by Terra or Novaterra, but by something else, something that didn't want to be found. And then there's the Tyranids. At the time of the Interregnum, the Tyranid hive fleets hadn't yet made their full presence known. But were they already watching? Testing? Sending bioforms into isolated systems to probe the Imperium's weaknesses? Some fans believe that the chaos of this war accelerated the Tyranid threat, giving the hive mind valuable insight into the Imperium's true vulnerabilities. The Interregnum should have been an internal conflict, a war between men over power and control. But in a galaxy as brutal as this one, no war ever stays isolated for long. The Imperium may have thought they were only fighting themselves, but in reality, they were bleeding in front of a pack of predators. And as the war raged on, as more and more systems burned, the enemies of mankind only grew bolder. Because if there's one thing that every Xenos and heretic knows, it's this: when the Imperium is divided, it is at its weakest. And in the grim darkness of the far future, weakness is death. Every war must end, even in the nightmare that is Warhammer 40K, where conflicts can drag on for centuries. Something always gives way. The Novaterra Interregnum had raged for nearly 1,000 years, bleeding the Imperium dry, stretching its military and bureaucracy to the brink of collapse. And yet, when it finally ended, it wasn't because of some grand battle or a decisive moment that shattered one side's will to fight. No, it ended the way most wars do in the Imperium, through sheer, grinding, inevitable exhaustion. At its height, Novaterra had been a true threat. It wasn't just a rogue faction. It was a parallel Imperium, with its own rulers, armies, and economy. It had held vast swaths of space under its control, and for a time, it really seemed like it could last. Maybe not as a direct rival to Terra, but as a permanent breakaway state, something akin to a second Imperium existing alongside the first. But that future never came to pass. The real question is why. Novaterra had powerful backers. It had fleets, armies, even entire Space Marine chapters siding with it. It wasn't some minor rebellion that could be crushed in a few years. And yet, despite all that, it still fell. One of the biggest reasons? Logistics. For all its power, Novaterra was still a fragment of a larger whole. It had resources, yes, but nowhere near the industrial might of the entire Imperium. Terra had spent thousands of years entrenching itself as the heart of mankind's empire, controlling the most vital trade routes, the largest forge worlds, the deepest stockpiles of war material. Novaterra had been fighting on borrowed time from the very start, relying on the momentum of its early victories and the enthusiasm of its separatist supporters. But wars are won not just by bold ideas, but by the ability to keep fighting. As the war dragged on, Novaterra's resources stretched thinner and thinner. Some of its strongest allies, noble houses, planetary governors, rogue admirals, began to reconsider their loyalties. They weren't necessarily losing faith in Novaterra's ideals, but they were losing patience. The war wasn't ending, and every year it continued, it became clearer that Novaterra simply didn't have the logistical infrastructure to sustain itself indefinitely. The second major problem? Internal fractures. For all the rhetoric about unity and a new vision for the Imperium, Novaterra was never truly united. It was a coalition of opportunists, some who genuinely believed in the cause, others who just wanted a bigger piece of the pie. In the beginning, this didn't matter. They had a common enemy, a shared purpose. But as the war dragged on and it became clear that total victory was impossible, those internal tensions boiled over. Some factions within Novaterra wanted to negotiate with Terra, hoping for a peace settlement that would allow them to retain some autonomy. Others wanted to double down, believing that only total war could secure their independence. And then there were those who saw the writing on the wall and started cutting deals behind closed doors to reintegrate themselves into the Imperium before the hammer finally fell. These fractures weakened Novaterra more than any battle ever could. They slowed decision-making, led to betrayals, and in some cases, outright civil war within separatist territories. The Imperium, ever patient, ever relentless, simply waited. It didn't need to win in a single decisive strike. It just needed to outlast the rebellion. And then there were the external threats. The Novaterra Interregnum hadn't taken place in a vacuum. As the Imperium tore itself apart, chaos, xenos, and opportunistic warlords descended like scavengers. Orc warbands swarmed unprotected systems, Dark Eldar raiders snatched entire planets into the abyss of Kamara, and chaos cults thrived in the instability. Novaterra, which had once prided itself on being a strong alternative to Terra's decaying rule, now found itself just as vulnerable as the Imperium it had broken away from. And then, finally, came the Imperium's final counteroffensive. Terra had never been idle. While Novaterra had spent centuries fighting to survive, the Imperium had been consolidating power, reclaiming lost ground, and preparing for the final push. When the moment came, it was devastating. The Adeptus Astartes, still overwhelmingly loyal to Terra, spearheaded assaults on key Novaterra strongholds. The Titan legions marched across rebellious worlds, crushing Novaterra's defenses. The Inquisition unleashed terror, hunting down and eliminating Novaterra's leadership. And in the end, the Imperium didn't just defeat Novaterra, it erased it. Some say the final days of Novaterra weren't a grand battle, but a quiet collapse. One by one, its strongest supporters abandoned it. Its armies stopped, fighting. Some surrendered, others simply vanished, retreating into the shadows, waiting for another time, another war. When Terra's forces finally arrived at Novaterra's capital, they didn't find a defiant, unbreakable enemy. They found ruins, a government that had already begun to tear itself apart from the inside. There's still debate among fans about whether Novaterra ever had a real chance of winning. Some argue that if they had secured more allies, particularly among the Forge Worlds and the Mechanicum, they might have survived as a second Imperium. Others believe they were doomed from the start, that the Imperium's sheer size and inertia made it impossible for any rebellion, no matter how well organized, to break away permanently. But here's the real question. Did Terra actually win? Yes, Novaterra was defeated. Yes, the Imperium was reunified. But at what cost? The Interregnum had lasted for centuries, draining the Imperium's strength, shattering entire sectors and proving once again that mankind's greatest enemy isn't chaos or Xenos, but itself. The Imperium that emerged from the Novaterra Interregnum wasn't stronger, it was weaker, more paranoid, more authoritarian. The Administratum tightened its grip, ensuring that such a rebellion could never happen again. The Ecclesiarchy purged anyone who had ever questioned Terra's rule, and the scars of the war left entire regions of space in ruin, many of which would never fully recover. And the enemies of mankind? They were still out there, stronger than ever, waiting for the next time the Imperium would stumble. Because if history had proven anything, it was this. The Imperium of man is always at war, and sometimes its greatest battles aren't against the horrors of the galaxy. Sometimes its greatest battles are against itself. The war was over. Novaterra was gone, its dream of a breakaway Imperium reduced to ash. The banners were torn down, the rebels hunted, their fleets shattered. The High Lords of Terra declared victory, and the Imperium was whole once more. But if you think that meant things went back to normal, you don't understand the way history works in the grim darkness of the far future. Nothing ever truly ends. Every war leaves scars. Every rebellion, no matter how thoroughly crushed, leaves cracks in the foundation of the Imperium, cracks that never fully heal. The Novaterra Interregnum changed everything. Some of those changes were immediate, while others would take millennia to fully reveal themselves. But one thing was certain. The Imperium that came out of this war was not the same one that went in. One of the first and most obvious consequences was the tightening of control. The Imperium had been fractured for centuries, and now that it was back under Terra's rule, the High Lords were determined to make sure it never happened again. The Adeptus Administratum became even more bloated, more ruthless, and more paranoid. Systems that had shown even the slightest hesitation in their loyalty were punished harshly, whole populations executed, noble houses stripped of power, planetary governors replaced with officials who would never dare question Terra again. The Imperium had always been an oppressive bureaucracy, but after the Interregnum, it became even more suffocating, with oversight and regulation choking the life out of countless worlds. Then there was the Ecclesiarchy. If there was one thing the Adeptus Ministorum learned from the Interregnum, it was that faith alone wasn't enough. They had failed to keep the Imperium united, failed to prevent the ideological fractures that had led to Novaterra's rise. And so, they doubled down. Heresy became an even broader term, encompassing not just chaos worship or Xenos corruption, but even questioning the authority of Terra itself. The Ministorum worked hand in hand with the Inquisition to eradicate any lingering sympathies for Novaterra, launching purges that some say lasted for centuries. And then there were the Space Marines. The Astartes had been divided during the war, and that was something the Imperium could not allow to happen again. Chapters that had sided with Novaterra were either eradicated or forced into exile, their names erased from history. Even chapters that had stayed loyal were watched more carefully than ever before. The Imperium had seen what happened when too many Space Marines started thinking for themselves, and it didn't like the results. This led to even stricter control over the Astartes, with more oversight from the Adeptus Terra and an increased reliance on political maneuvering to ensure no chapter could ever become too powerful or too independent again. But the real question is, did the Imperium actually learn anything? Some argue that it did. The Interregnum was proof that the Imperium's structure was not invincible, that even after the Horus Heresy, even after 10,000 years of brutal rule, the Imperium could still be shaken from within. That realization led to some subtle shifts in governance, more focus on maintaining stability in the outer reaches, more effort put into keeping key military assets loyal and supplied. The Imperium didn't reform, but it did adapt, if only in the coldest, most practical way possible. Others argue that the Imperium learned the wrong lessons. Instead of recognizing the weaknesses in its system, instead of fixing the inefficiencies that had led to the interregnum in the first place, it doubled down on everything that was already broken. More bureaucracy, more religious fanaticism, more paranoia. It crushed any hint of dissent, but in doing so, it may have ensured that the next great fracture, whenever it comes, will be even worse. And let's be real, there will be a next time. The Imperium never truly learns. It survives, it endures, it grinds its enemies into dust, but it never fixes itself. The cracks that led to the Novaterra interregnum never really went away. They were just patched over, hidden beneath, by layers of oppression and dogma. Some fans speculate that if the Imperium ever suffers another civil war, something on the scale of the Horus heresy, it won't just be chaos that takes advantage of the chaos. It won't just be Xenos empires waiting in the shadows. It'll be something like Novaterra, another breakaway faction, another rebellion fueled not by heresy, but by the simple reality that the Imperium is unsustainable. Maybe not in the next 100 years, maybe not in the next 1,000, but one day the Imperium will crack again. And next time, it might not recover. The Novaterra interregnum was a warning, a glimpse into a future the Imperium refuses to acknowledge, a reminder that no empire, no matter how vast, no matter how ruthless, can hold itself together forever. For nearly 1,000 years, the Imperium was divided, and for a terrifying moment, it looked like it might never come back together. This wasn't just another war against an external enemy, another Xenos invasion or chaos incursion. This was something far more dangerous. This was a war against itself. And the scariest part? It didn't happen because of some grand betrayal or some overwhelming outside force. It happened because the Imperium itself is fundamentally flawed. Because its own inefficiency, its own bloated bureaucracy, its own blind fanaticism made something like Novaterra inevitable. The Imperium is a machine built for war, but it is not built to last. And deep down, everyone knows it. So the real question isn't whether the Novaterra interregnum could happen again. The real question is when. Every time the Imperium suffers a major crisis, you can see the cracks widening. The Imperium only survives because it never stops moving, never stops crushing its enemies beneath sheer, relentless momentum. But if that ever slows down, if the right combination of disasters hits at once, a second Novaterra could rise. Maybe not in the same form, maybe not in the same place, but the idea of breaking away from Terra, of forging a different path, of finally rejecting the outdated, decaying rule of a corpse throne. That idea never dies. Some fans argue that the Imperium only survives because it keeps tightening its grip, that it learned from the interregnum and made sure something like this could never happen again. Others argue that it just got lucky, that if the circumstances had been just a little different, if Novaterra had played its cards better, the Imperium might have actually collapsed. And if it could have happened once, it could happen again. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But one day, the Imperium will reach a breaking point it can't recover from. And when that day comes, the galaxy is going to burn. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the Imperium's darkest chapters, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. What do you think? Could something like Novaterra happen again? Or is the Imperium too strong, too entrenched to ever truly fall apart? Let's talk about it. And as always, stay vigilant, because in the grim darkness of the far future, history is always waiting to repeat itself.